The same car had been parked next to me for 3 hours. Every time I woke up, it was still there, engine off, headlights pointed at my window. All right, welcome back. If you're new here, this is where people send in the stuff that actually happened to them, no scripts, no actors, just real accounts. Today's theme is highway rest areas, those little pull-offs with a vending machine and some picnic tables where you stop for 20 minutes to stretch your legs on a long drive. Nobody thinks twice about them in daylight. At 2 in the morning, alone, they're a completely different place. Both of tonight's stories came from people who drive a lot, for work and otherwise, and both of them say the same thing now, that they look at these places differently ever since. Let's get into the first one. Story 1, the car that wouldn't leave. I drove long haul for a regional trucking company for about 4 years, mostly routes that kept me out 2 or 3 nights at a stretch. Rest areas were basically my second home. You learn the good ones from the bad ones fast, which ones have decent lighting, which ones the trucks stop across the street, make safer just by being close, which ones you avoid after dark no matter how tired you are. It's a kind of knowledge you build up without meaning to, just from spending enough nights parked in enough different lots, that patterns start to emerge, which spots feel fine, and which ones give you a reason to keep driving another 20 minutes even when your eyes are burning. This one particular rest area, off a stretch of interstate I drove maybe twice a month, was one I'd stopped at probably 30 times over the years, without a single problem. Well-lit, decent amount of traffic even overnight, the kind of place where you could actually get real sleep in your cab, instead of the half-alert doze you do at the sketchier stops. I'd never thought twice about it. If anything, I recommended it to newer drivers when they asked about good overnight spots on that route. I pulled in around midnight, tired enough that I wasn't planning on more than a 6-hour stretch before getting back on the road. There were maybe 8 or 9 other vehicles scattered around the lot when I arrived. Mix of trucks and regular cars, nothing that stood out to me at the time. I backed into a spot, did my usual routine, checked my logs, texted my wife that I'd made it to my stop for the night, the way I did every single trip, and was out within 20 minutes. Quick thing before I keep going. If this is your first time here, we do stories like this every week, so go ahead and hit subscribe now so it shows up whenever we post the next one. All right, back to the story. I woke up sometime later, not from any noise, just that natural half-wake you do a few times during a long sleep. Out of habit, I glanced out my window, checking my surroundings the way you do automatically after years on the road. There was a car parked in the spot directly beside my cab, close enough that it hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I was sure of that. Sedan, dark color, hard to tell exactly what under the lot lighting. Engine off, headlights off. Nothing unusual about a car pulling in next to me at a rest area. People do that constantly. I went back to sleep without thinking much of it. The next time I woke up, glancing at my phone, maybe 2 hours had passed. I looked out the window again, same habit, and the car was still there. Same position, same everything, like it hadn't moved an inch. I couldn't see anyone inside from my angle. Windows too dark, but something about seeing the exact same car in the exact same spot, unmoved, at nearly 3 in the morning, didn't sit right, even though logically, there were a dozen reasons someone might park somewhere for a few hours. Rest stops. People do that. I lay there for a minute just staring at it through the gap in my curtain, trying to talk myself back down. No engine sound, no interior light, no movement of any kind, not even the small shifting you'd expect from someone trying to get comfortable enough to sleep in a car seat. It was that total stillness that bothered me more than anything specific, the sense that whatever was in that car wasn't actually resting the way a normal person would. I drifted back off, telling myself I was being paranoid, that kind of low-grade unease that doesn't fully wake you up, but doesn't let you sleep deeply either. Third time I woke up, it was almost 5, getting close to when I'd planned on leaving anyway. I looked out that window one more time, mostly out of habit at this point, and the car was gone. Relief, honestly, more relief than the situation probably warranted. I sat up, started my usual pre-drive routine, coffee, checking my logs, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The car wasn't gone. It had moved. It was now parked directly behind my trailer, close enough that backing out normally would have been a problem, positioned in a way that no rational person parks at an empty rest area, with dozens of open spots available. Headlights on this time pointed directly at my back window. My coffee sat forgotten on the dash, going cold, while I just stared at it through the mirror, trying to process what I was actually looking at. I sat there for a solid minute just watching it, trying to convince myself there was an explanation. Maybe someone had simply repositioned for a better sleeping angle. Maybe caught some morning sun through their windshield. Whatever. I couldn't make myself fully believe any of it. I thought about all the ordinary reasons a car might end up parked differently than where it started. Someone moving to avoid a puddle. Someone backing in instead of pulling forward. Small things that happen at rest areas all the time, without meaning anything at all. None of those explanations accounted for the specific angle it had chosen, aimed directly at my back window, in a lot with dozens of open spaces elsewhere. I climbed into my seat, started the engine, and made a show of clearly preparing to pull out, partly hoping whoever was in that car would take the hint and move, if their intentions were as innocent as I wanted to believe. Nothing happened. The car just sat there, headlights steady, engine now audibly running, based on the faint exhaust visible in my mirror. At one point, before calling dispatch, I actually got out of my cab, just for a few seconds, just to get a slightly better angle, and see if I could make out anyone through that windshield. I regretted it almost immediately. Standing on the pavement, closer to that car than I'd been the whole night, I still couldn't see a driver, couldn't make out a silhouette. Nothing, even with the headlights on, and the morning starting to lighten the sky. Just an empty-looking front seat, as far as I could tell, though something about the angle of the light on the glass made it hard to be fully certain. I climbed back into my cab faster than I'd gotten out of it. I called it into my dispatch, more as a just-in-case than anything else, gave them my location and a description, told them I felt uneasy about pulling out with this vehicle positioned where it was. My dispatcher, decent guy, told me to just wait it out if I could, that he'd note it in case anything came of it, but that legally, there wasn't much anyone could do about a car parked in a public rest area regardless of how it made me feel. I waited almost 20 minutes. Other trucks were starting their engines around me by then. Morning traffic picking up in the lot. More witnesses, more activity. I kept my own engine running the whole time, some instinct telling me I wanted to be ready to move the second I had a clear path. Though a clear path to where, I couldn't have told you, since the car wasn't blocking me in completely, just close enough to make the maneuver uncomfortable and slow. Somewhere in that stretch of minutes, without me actually seeing it move, the car was just gone. I hadn't looked away for more than a few seconds at a time, checking my mirrors, my phone, my paperwork, and at some point during all that, it left. I pulled out maybe 10 minutes later, checked my mirrors obsessively for the next hour of driving, half expecting to see it again, somewhere behind me on the interstate. It never showed up again, not that day, not on any of my later trips through that same rest area, though I'll admit I started avoiding overnight stops there after that, adding an extra hour to some routes just to reach a different stop instead, even when it meant getting into my next delivery window later than I would have liked. I mentioned it to another driver a few months later, one of the regulars I'd run into occasionally at various stops, half expecting him to tell me I was overreacting to nothing. He didn't laugh it off the way I expected. He just got quiet for a second and asked if the car had been dark-colored, no visible plates that I could recall. I told him I honestly couldn't remember the plates, hadn't thought to check in the moment, too focused on everything else. He nodded slowly and said that description had come up before, from at least 2 other drivers he knew, always at rest areas, along that same general stretch of interstate, always the same pattern, parking close, moving without being seen to move, eventually just leaving before anyone got a clear look at who was inside. I asked him if he had any theories about what it actually was, expecting either a shrug or some kind of joke to lighten the conversation. Instead, he just said he'd stopped parking overnight on that stretch entirely, rerouted his own runs the same way I had, and left it at that. like it was a settled thing among the drivers who knew about it, something you just adjusted for rather than talked about too much. The way people quietly avoid certain roads or certain gas stations, without ever fully explaining why to anyone who hasn't already heard the stories themselves. I still drive that route occasionally, when the job requires it, but I've never gone back to stopping overnight at that particular rest area since. I plan my fuel and my hours around reaching a different stop instead. Even when it costs me time, I'd rather not lose, because losing an hour on a delivery window feels like a much easier problem to have than sitting parked in that lot again, waiting to see if something pulls up beside me that doesn't leave the normal way things are supposed to leave. A few of the other regulars on that route eventually mentioned similar stories too, once I started actually asking around instead of keeping it to myself. Enough of them that I stopped assuming it had just been me having an unusually paranoid night. That's the first story. Quick thing before the next one: if you drive for a living, or just take a lot of long road trips, you're probably going to relate to this next story even more. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe. It really does help a small channel like this keep going, and it means the next one lands in your feed without you having to go searching for it. Alright, let's get into it. Story 2. The Man at the Vending Machine. I was driving home from visiting my sister, a trip that put me on the road for about 6 hours total, most of it through pretty rural stretches of highway, with long gaps between any actual towns. The kind of drive where your phone loses signal for 20 minutes at a time, and you just have to trust the road signs. I'd left later than planned, which meant a good chunk of the drive ended up happening well after dark, something I don't love doing alone, but wasn't going to reschedule an entire visit, especially since I only got to see my sister a few times a year with both of our schedules. Around midnight, getting tired enough that continuing felt like a bad idea, I pulled into a rest area to stretch my legs, grab a snack from the vending machines, and splash some water on my face before pushing through the last 2 hours. The lot was mostly empty, maybe 4 or 5 other cars scattered around. A couple of trucks parked further off in the section clearly meant for them, everything about it looking like exactly the kind of unremarkable stop I'd made 100 times before on other drives. I want to say upfront that I've stopped at plenty of rest areas alone at night before. I'm generally careful, aware of my surroundings, not someone who walks around oblivious to who's near me. This night started exactly the same as every other uneventful stop I'd made over the years. Real quick, if you're liking the channel so far, go ahead and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think for something this size, and it means you'll see whatever we post next without having to go looking for it. Okay, continuing on. I walked toward the small building that housed the vending machines and restrooms, noticing one other person already there. A man standing at the vending machines, maybe in his 40s, unremarkable in every way I registered in that first glance. Jacket, jeans, nothing that stood out. I gave him the kind of brief acknowledgement you give any stranger in a shared space late at night. Nothing more. I used the restroom, came back out, and he was still at the vending machines, though I hadn't actually seen him buy anything the entire time. No snack in his hand, no drink, just standing there in front of the machines like he was deciding, except he'd been deciding for the several minutes I'd been inside. That struck me as odd even in the moment, before anything else had happened to make me suspicious, since most people know within about 10 seconds whether they want the chips or the candy bar. I got my own snack, feeling him watching me from a few feet away, though when I glanced over, he was looking at the machine, not at me, which I told myself meant I was reading too much into a completely normal situation. I headed back to my car, walking a little faster than my normal pace, without fully deciding to. As I was walking across the lot, I heard footsteps behind me, not rushing, just steady, matching my pace at a distance. I didn't turn around immediately, told myself it was probably just someone else heading to their own car. A rest area at midnight isn't exactly empty. Other travelers exist. I focused on the sound of my own keys in my hand, the weight of them, something to hold onto while I walked a little faster without breaking into an obvious jump. I got to my car, unlocked it, and glanced back before getting in. He was standing maybe 20 feet away, not moving toward me anymore. just standing in the middle of the lot, watching, not walking to a car of his own, not doing anything except standing there, facing my direction, hands at his sides, completely still, in a way that felt deliberate rather than idle. I got in fast, locked the doors immediately, something I always do out of habit, but did with considerably more urgency this time. I started the engine, and as I was pulling out of the space, I watched him in my mirror. He hadn't moved from that spot at all, still just standing in the middle of the lot, watching my car leave. I got back on the highway, checking my mirrors constantly for the first several miles, half convinced I'd see headlights following at a distance. Nothing came. Eventually my heart rate came down enough that I started telling myself the whole thing had probably been nothing. An odd guy having an odd night. Nothing that actually posed any threat. Just an uncomfortable few minutes that felt worse in the moment than it probably was in reality. I even laughed a little at myself, alone in the car, the way you do when adrenaline starts fading and embarrassment fills the space it leaves behind. I turned the radio up, tried to settle back into the normal rhythm of a long drive. Mile markers passing, that specific kind of blank highway focus that eats up distance without you fully noticing. For a while it worked. The tension in my shoulders eased. I actually started thinking about what I'd make for dinner once I got home. Small, mundane thoughts that felt good precisely because they were so ordinary. About 40 minutes later, still on that same stretch of mostly empty highway, I needed to stop again, unrelated to the vending machine guy. Just genuine exhaustion catching up with me faster than I expected. I pulled into a gas station in the next town, one of those 24-hour ones with bright lighting and an attendant visible through the window, specifically choosing it over another quiet rest area because of what had just happened. While I was filling up, a car pulled in on the far side of the pumps. I didn't think anything of it until the driver got out, and I recognized the jacket before I recognized the face. Same man from the vending machine. Same unremarkable jacket. Same build, walking toward the station's entrance, without so much as a glance in my direction. Like I wasn't even there, moving with that same unhurried pace that had unsettled me back at the rest area. Like he had absolutely nowhere he needed to be in any particular hurry. I want to be honest that I don't know for certain it was the same man. Jackets aren't unique. Builds aren't unique. And it was late enough, and I was tired enough, that my brain could easily have been filling in a match that wasn't really there. But something about the specific way he moved, the same unhurried, deliberate pace he'd had crossing that rest area parking lot, made my hands go cold on the gas pump handle, and I found myself doing math I didn't want to be doing, calculating how long it would take him to walk from the station entrance to wherever his car was parked relative to mine. Whether I'd have enough time to finish fueling and leave before he came back out. I didn't finish filling up all the way. I got just enough to comfortably make it home, got back in my car, and left before he came back out of the station, watching my mirrors the entire remaining drive in a way I'd never done before on a route I'd taken dozens of times without a second thought. I made it home fine. Nothing else happened that night, or any night since. I never found out if it really was the same person twice, coincidentally, on the same stretch of highway 40 minutes apart, or if my mind had just connected two unrelated strangers, because I was already primed to be afraid. But I don't stop at that particular rest area alone anymore, and if I'm being honest, I plan my route now, even for shorter trips, around which stops have people actually working inside them, rather than just vending machines and an empty parking lot. I told my sister about it a few weeks later, mostly because I felt like I needed to tell someone who'd actually understand how unsettling it had felt, rather than just brushing it off as an overreaction. She said something that stuck with me more than I expected it to. She said the scariest part wasn't really the man himself, since nothing had actually happened, no words exchanged, no threat made out loud. It was that total stillness, standing in the middle of an empty lot at midnight, watching a stranger's car drive away. Like watching wasn't even something he was trying to hide. Most people, if they're caught staring, look away, pretend they weren't. He never did that, not for a second, and that's the detail that still comes back to me, sometimes on long drives, more than anything else about that whole night. And that's it for today. If either of these hit close to home, especially if you've ever had that specific feeling of being watched somewhere you thought was just an ordinary stop, you're not alone, trust me. The comment section usually agrees, and it's honestly a little unsettling how many people have their own version of one of these. Whether it's a rest area, a gas station, or just some random parking lot on a long drive home. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think for a channel this size. And if something like this has ever happened to you at a rest area or gas station late at night, send it my way. You might hear your own story on here next. Stay safe out there. I'll see you in the next one.